Good afternoon and welcome to the NRCOP webinar on regulatory stewardship, why and how the Kiwis manage regulation as an asset. We have participants from different parts of the world at this webinar, so I would like to begin by acknowledging all First Peoples here today and pay my respects to them and their forebears. We honour your wisdom and your stewardship of traditional lands and seas and your customs which enrich us all. I'm Lorraine Cherney, Manager at the NRCOP and Honorary Research Fellow at the School of Political Science and International Studies at UQ. On behalf of ANZOG and the NRCOP, I'm delighted to welcome you to what is our 7th webinar for 2021. Before I introduce our panel, a little bit of housekeeping. To our regular viewers, you will be familiar with how we run things here. But for anyone joining us for the first time, or for any of your colleagues who may have missed today's webinar, all the webinars are recorded and will be made available on the ANZOG YouTube channel within 14 days. We'll be using the free Slido app for your questions and comments. On your phone or device, enter Slido into your browser and then hashtag ASSET, A-S-S-E-T, as your event code. You can start asking questions immediately, or if you like the look of another question, you can upvote that question. We are very fortunate here at the NRCOP to have access to such a great pool of experts to call upon to speak at our events, and today is no exception. Given that we are working within a 1-hour time slot, and we often run out of time to cover all of your questions during the Q&A session, we've asked our presenters to provide a little bit of written feedback to a number of questions that we will inevitably not be able to cover at today's session. We will then upload this supplementary resource to our website along with today's recording. It is now my privilege to introduce our two panelists for today, Professor Jeroen van der Heijden and Dr. Rebecca Foley. Jeroen is the Chair in Regulatory Practice at the School of Government, Victoria University of Wellington. He is involved in research on key innovation in regulatory governance and practice, including the use of behavioural incentives in regulation, regulatory stewardship, and the resilience of regulatory regimes. And he contributes to the training of those involved in regulatory issues in New Zealand and elsewhere. He has published widely on regulation and governance, including 5 books and over 60 articles in leading academic journals. Welcome, Jeroen. Rebecca. Rebecca is the Manager of Regulatory Stewardship Development at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, IMBI, and has worked at IMBI for almost 6 years. In her current role, Rebecca and her team have responsibility for coordinating IMBI's regulatory systems bills, running the regulatory impact analysis, quality assurance process, and building the tools needed to support confident regulatory stewards, such as a maturity assessment tool for regulatory systems and tools to start up systems level governance. Welcome, Rebecca. Today's session will run along the following lines. Jeroen will start with an overview on regulatory stewardship and its potential benefits for regulators. Rebecca will then take us through some examples of how an agency in New Zealand has put regulatory stewardship into practice, after which I will open it up to you, our audience, to ask some questions. So a quick reminder that we are using the Slido platform for questions and comments, and that the code is hashtag ASSET, A-S-S-E-T. If you're eager to participate, you can submit your questions straight away. Over to you, Jeroen.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and kia ora to all the viewers out there, to all the people who are here today at this fantastic seminar. And of course, it's a pleasure to me to be asked to kick off this seminar on regulatory stewardship, which is one of those topics that is slowly gaining traction in New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere in the world. And for those of you who have been engaged with the NRCLP, you will be aware that since 2013, New Zealand's regulatory agencies have had a statutory obligation to carry out regulatory stewardship. They have been expected to adopt a whole of system life cycle view of regulation and take a proactive and collaborative approach to monitor and care of the regulatory systems for which they have responsibilities. Next slide, please. Today, I will explore the idea of regulatory stewardship as being an ideal and a practice. I will look at the main regulatory stewardship challenges that come to regulators. And finally, I will drive home the message that I think that optimal regulatory stewardship is likely the sum of suboptimal parts. Please, next slide. So much of the literature that I will touch on today is available elsewhere, and you will have access to the slides and can read or watch this at your own convenience. Next slide, please. So before I begin talking about regulatory stewardship in general, we should ask the question, is it a uniquely New Zealand idea? Now, the long answer short is no, it is not. After all, for a very long time, governments around the world have developed principles and guiding philosophies for the regulation of regulation. Next slide, please. So, for example, in the mid-1940s in the United States, the Administrative Procedure Act was introduced. And that act requires regulatory agencies to keep the public informed of how they are organized and what kind of procedures and rules they use, how they involve the public in the development and implementation of regulation, and to follow uniform standards for making and implementing rules. Next slide, please. Then on the other side of the Atlantic, in the year 2000 or around the year 2000, the European Commission launched its Better Regulation agenda. And like that example that I just showed from the United States, this Better Regulation agenda is a set of requirements and expectations for regulatory agencies at the EU level. And it aims to ensure that regulation is implemented openly and transparently, built on the best available evidence, is backed by stakeholders, and respects the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. Now, of course, down under, we have seen similar developments since the early 1980s. So first, Australia and New Zealand set off on a trajectory of regulatory reform, guided by the principles and underlying philosophy of deregulation and reduction of red tape. So, while we see that in Australia that philosophy of deregulation is still followed very strongly, in New Zealand the focus has shifted to regulatory stewardship. Next slide, please. Now, over time, the expectations for regulatory stewardship have been developed by the New Zealand Treasury, and the latest guidance comes from April 2017. So on this slide, you can see that the Treasury defines regulatory stewardship as a responsibility of government regulatory agencies. It involves them to adopt a whole of system, life cycle view of regulation, and taking a proactive, collaborative approach to the monitoring and care of the regulatory systems within which they have policy or operational responsibilities. Now, on the next slide, I'll show you what that means in day-to-day practice. So stewardship responsibilities require regulators to keep track of the performance of their regulatory systems. So that is the part where regulators are expected to monitor, review, and report on regulatory systems. They are expected to keep their regulatory systems fit for purpose through robust analysis and implementation of their regulatory systems. And they have to ensure proper implementation of their regulatory systems. So that is the part where good regulatory practice comes in. Now, these responsibilities and expectations are to some extent laid down by the Treasury. But it is relevant here to note that regulatory agencies here in New Zealand are expected to do all of this actively and without requiring their ministers' explicit direction or permission. Now, on the next slide, I will show you some findings that I got from discussions with agencies here in New Zealand about how they experience this regulatory stewardship responsibility that they have. And over the last years, it has become evident to me that many seem to struggle to operationalize their stewardship obligations and role. And that struggle has at least three overlapping origins. So first, the overall regulatory stewardship obligation is akin to performance-based regulation. It stipulates the intent or outcome to be achieved, but leaves a large amount of discretionary space to regulatory agencies to fill in that stewardship role. The intent or outcome is that regulatory systems are an asset for New Zealanders and not a liability. Regulatory stewardship, in the words of the Treasury, then is simply a means of having a proactive duty of care of the regulatory system that belongs to or exists for the benefit of others. But as is so often the case with performance-based regulation, as you will be very aware of, the targets of that performance-based regulation, and in this case agencies, often want to know what minimum requirement they have to comply with. So the second challenge is that the New Zealand government expects regulatory agencies to work collaboratively on their stewardship responsibilities. Now, unfortunately, little progress has been made to date as regards such collaboration. Within system engagement between agencies remains the biggest implementation challenge of regulatory stewardship to date. And arguably, it is impossible to achieve that whole of system perspective that the Treasury has in mind unless multiple agencies truly work together. Now, it could be argued that the Treasury envisaged an individual regulatory agency as just a steward of a regulatory system or systems, but never the steward of that system. And whether that lack of collaboration that I was just talking about between regulatory agencies results from a lack of clarity about their regulatory stewardship obligations or a lack of resourcing and commitment at the agency level is beyond of my presentation today. What I do want to add, however, is that the Treasury has recently started an initiative to further support agencies in operationalizing their stewardship obligations. Now, the last challenge is actually one of the most, perhaps one of the most problematic ones. There is a lot of conceptual confusion about what stewardship is, what it could be, and what it should be. So the idea of regulatory stewardship aims to introduce a coherent or holistic whole of government regulation of regulation. And it aims to introduce a guiding philosophy for regulatory reform. So in that extent, or to that extent, what we see happening in New Zealand is more or less similar to what we see happening around the world. But of course, the term stewardship indicates that the New Zealand government has a high ambition in this respect. So let's have a look on the following slides at what stewardship is. Now, the idea of stewardship frequently recurs in the organization, management, and governance literature. For example, stewardship theory is a theory devised to explain and conceptualize organizational behavior, and it applies to public and private organizations. Contrary to many other organizational theories, this specific theory holds that leaders of organizations are willing to act in their organization's best interest and are motivated to do so by a need and desire to perform excellently and with honor. So to nurture stewardship behavior in that theory is to provide leaders with rewards that give them intrinsic motivation, such as a chance to grow and achieve self-actualization, rather than providing them with ever larger gains. In similar vein, ethical stewardship is a theory devised to explain and conceptualize the relationship between organizations and their staff, as well as their stakeholders. So central to this theory is the need for organizations to create trust by engaging their staff and stakeholders in important decisions that involve them, and share critical information about things that may affect staff and stakeholders. Now, honoring the duties owed by organizations to their staff and stakeholders is then expected to nurture and strengthen the long-term commitment of these external parties, so the staff and the stakeholders. Now, both these theories focus on what you could call an activity side of stewardship. Then other theories that have emerged over the last years focus much more on what you could call the structural side of stewardship. So that includes institutional and process aspects of what it means to be a steward and how you can be a steward. So for example, theories on corporate stewardship hold that the type of virtuous organizational practices and values should be thoroughly institutionalized within the organizational culture, rather than being dependent on individuals within the organization. And such institutionalization may be achieved by training future organizational leaders and having well-articulated organizational values and clear and transparent internal accountability processes. Now, in the slipstream of those theories that focus more on the structural aspects of stewardship, there is an ever-expanding codification of stewardship expectations and an ever-expanding set of frameworks for embedding stewardship within organizational structures. And many of you will have heard about initiatives such as the Forest Stewardship Council or the Marine Stewardship Council that effectively provide organizations with a set of guidelines for putting the idea of stewardship into practice and to be held accountable for following these guidelines. So in sum, stewardship as a guiding philosophy is one of those aspects or one of those concepts that we all tend to define slightly differently. There is no fixed understanding of what exactly is meant by stewardship in the academic, the policy, or the practitioner literature. With that caution in mind, as the quotes on the following slides show you, it is safe to say that stewardship broadly implies the careful management of something that belongs to others. Or to give another quote, it is about leaving something in a better condition for future use by future generations. So in similar vein, stewardship is generally accepted to not necessarily own the entity that is being taken responsibility for, and it is about not necessarily having the right or control of that what is being given responsibility for. So in sum, the simple term stewardship encapsulates a wide variety of meanings and expectations. And that comes with a number of stewardship challenges that I'll show on the next slide. So first, the idea of stewardship is both a virtue and a mechanism. So as a virtue, it touches on values such as looking after each other's interests, taking care of what is given in trust, serving others, and looking after the interests of future generations. But as a mechanism, it touches on practical issues, such as being accountable for one's actions, being honest, not taking unnecessary risks with what is given in trust, and keeping in mind short-term and long-term outcomes. Another challenge is that stewardship is both about activity and structure. As an activity, it touches on the motivations of human and organizational behavior. It raises questions, for example, about how we nurture organizational leaders, staff, and stakeholders to see the prosperity of their organizations and the environments they serve and influence them and see them as more important than their personal interests. Now, as a structure, stewardship touches on the processes and institutions that we have in place to indeed operationalize stewardship. And that very much resonates with the idea of stewardship as a mechanism, which includes accountability processes, transparency requirements, risk reduction strategies, and periodical reviews. Last but not least, the idea of stewardship is both outward-looking and inward-looking. As outward-looking, it very clearly touches on the central understanding that stewardship is about holding something in trust for another, whether this is a current order or a future order. Now, as inward looking, it touches on the responsibility and obligations of collectives and organizations to serve the well-being of those that make up these collectives and these organizations. So, for instance, the staff of regulatory agencies. So, three key regulatory challenges that come with the idea of introducing regulatory stewardship. And we can safely conclude from all that I was just talking about that it is very hard to define exactly what regulatory stewardship is, let alone what it takes to be a good regulatory steward. Of course, it goes without saying that some stewardship mechanisms need to be in place to achieve stewardship as a virtue. And in the remainder of my presentation, I will use that literature that I have just discussed to make some starting points for thinking about the necessary elements of regulatory stewardship as a mechanism. Particularly when we think about how stewardship structural aspects can be merged with the outward and inward looking focus. Now, on this 2x2 diagram, I will show you some elements that I think that are important to think about if you want to put regulatory stewardship into practice. Now, don't try to read it in full. I'm going to take you through it step by step. So in the top left cell, we see the inward-looking activity part of regulatory stewardship. It is here where we ask questions about how staff is involved in decision-making, how they are rewarded and nurtured, and how we want our leaders to act. In the top right cell, we see the outward-looking activity part of regulatory stewardship. It is here where we ask questions about how to engage with stakeholders in essential decisions, how we share information, how we make sure to be receptive to public concerns about our work. In the bottom left cell, we see the inward-looking structure part of regulatory stewardship. It's here where we ask questions about internal accountability processes, systems of monitoring and evaluation, and typically risk-based allocation of our limited regulatory resources. Finally, in the bottom right cell, we see the outward-looking structure of regulatory stewardship. And it is here where we ask questions about external accountability processes and where we want to use apply and explain principles about what we are doing and how we are collaborating with other agencies. Now, please keep in mind that that the cells just provide some aspects of what I think would make for good regulatory stewardship. It is not an exhaustive list. But what I do hope for at least the Australian participants is that this way of thinking about regulatory stewardship, at the very least, is a much broader understanding of the concept of how currently the Morrison government seems to be using the term regulatory stewardship as a new public management approach to regulatory reform. Now, if we go back to that diagram, you will see that it now has a number of blue and red circles. So if we look at them and sort of step back and think about what is it that those different cells truly illustrate, we will get to see that actually all the parts of that regulatory stewardship map that I have just talked about are things that most likely most regulators are very familiar with. So that bottom left cell really talks about effective regulatory governance, effective and efficient regulatory governance. And the bottom right cell really talks about legitimacy and regulatory accountability within regulatory governance. Then the top right cell really talks about what has become very popular over the last decades: participation, collaboration, whole of government, and all these issues that are important in contemporary regulatory governance. What I think is truly unique about the idea of stewardship is that it also brings in that cultural aspect. So that issue that we see in the top left cell, so the issue that I have identified here as a red cell. So that is where I think the idea of regulatory stewardship in New Zealand is different from these big reforms of regulation that we see elsewhere in the world. Now, before I round up, I want to introduce two more regulatory stewardship challenges. And the first is that even though the idea of regulatory stewardship follows that holistic thinking, the risk of unpacking it as I have done it here is that different parts of your regulatory agency want to claim ownership of a part of the regulatory stewardship mission. So your economists might want to optimize everything that is happening in the bottom left cell. They want to make everything as effective and efficient as possible. And maybe your legal people want to make everything as accountable and transparent as possible. So they might want to take ownership of that bottom right cell. Yet organizational people, people involved in the change of organizations in your organization might want to embrace that top left cell and want to improve the organization. But like I said at the very start, I think that another driving factor of good regulatory stewardship is to embrace this idea that optimal regulatory stewardship likely requires suboptimal paths. And what I mean with that is that, of course, there will be trade-offs between all these values that regulatory stewardship tries to capture. So there is no point trying to optimize each of the individual parts of it if you don't think about what are the optimal trade-offs that we can achieve. That's sort of one thing that will really ask us to think differently about regulatory reform. So again, thinking about an optimum outcome that will be a configuration of likely suboptimal paths. That's one big lesson I think that is important to take home. And the other thing is that if we think about regulatory stewardship this way, it means that we can have multiple optimal forms. Now, with that, I'm going to leave it and I hand you over to Rebecca. Thanks for your time and enjoy the next one.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. And now we'll pass over to Dr. Rebecca Foley. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Rather humbled to be following Jeroen with all of that theory. I was getting worried I wouldn't be able to pass the exam at the end. Still might not be able to. What I'm going to do is give you a taste of how a ministry has actually put regulatory stewardship into practice. And what I'm talking about is a small slice of MB, which I'll give you a little overview of in a moment. MB is really quite large by New Zealand standards. We've got about 5,000 staff, 57 officers, a reasonably large operating budget. And I'm going to be talking about the work of a small team in MB that focuses almost exclusively on regulatory stewardship today. So not some of the work that's been done in our amazing operational groups or policy groups. So MBIE, its purpose is Hikina Whakatutuki, which is lifting to make successful or to grow New Zealand for all. And what we would say is that about 75% of our people are involved in regulation in some way. So it might be designing it in our policy and legal teams, it might be delivering it in our investigations, enforcement, information and education or dispute resolution teams, or it might be monitoring and evaluating it in our evidence and insights teams. You've heard from Jeroen that regulatory stewardship is a relatively new concept. There is no definition of it or indeed even a common language. So I talk about regulatory stewardship as being both a mindset and a set of practices to ensure that we don't set and forget our regulatory stock. And instead we learn and adapt to ensure that it continues to deliver the outcomes for New Zealanders. The risk of not taking a learn and adapt approach is failure, and we have paid for that in the past. One of our most significant being the explosion in the Pike River mine on the 19th of November 2010, which killed 29 men. That, plus the subsequent reforms that were needed to ensure that we were keeping people safe at work, has actually cost more than New Zealand's 19 years in Afghanistan. Leaky buildings is another failure, where timber-built homes were not fully weathertight, leading to mould and decay that led to poor health outcomes, death of people, and of course also additional regulatory reform. My understanding is that the number of people killed as a result of leaky buildings is more than died in our Christchurch earthquake, which is also very significant for New Zealand. So taking a stewardship approach is really quite a no-brainer, and I actually believe it's the right thing to do as public servants. And I do actually appreciate that it's a relatively new concept, only added to our broader public management system in 2013. But what this focus does is it gives us the opportunity to focus on regulation, which has some pretty gnarly aspects to it, such as the use of the awesome or coercive powers of the state to incentivise certain behaviours. And with that comes the complexity and uncertainty of knowing what works to change behaviours and how we'd know. Essentially, there's no playbook for this type of work, and what good looks like, I believe, will evolve and change over time as we learn from what we're doing. So the branch that I work in is at the front end of trying to drive out some of this uncertainty so we can understand what good looks like and actually support people to be confident regulatory stewards. And to me, it's very people-centred work, which fits well with my values. Now, look, I've had this slide up here. It's really rather busy. Please don't think you have to read it. I will be sharing my slides later. But what this does is gives you a taste of the complexity here at MB. So what we've got down the left-hand side there, which you probably can't really see, is a list of our regulatory systems. Now, we've taken an arts and craft approach to defining these regulatory systems, by which we have weighed up being comprehensive, so we capture all of our regulatory responsibilities, as well as having a reasonable and acceptable unit of analysis. So, for instance, we haven't put everything into our employment standards regulatory system, which could have, say, included immigration or workplace health and safety as well, because it quickly becomes unwieldy. But what this does along the top there is it shows you that in each regulatory system, we say there's about 8 different functions. So there's policy, delivery, monitoring and evaluation, and dispute resolution, for example. And what the colours show is the complexity whereby you have different agencies performing different roles. So, for example, in our employment system, MB plays almost all of those roles. We set the policy, we do the op-poll, we do the service delivery, education and information, investigations, and dispute resolution. Whereas in our accident compensation and corporation, ACC regulatory system, we only do the policy and the monitoring and evaluation, and other agencies perform those other roles. So that immediately shows you one of the challenges of regulatory stewardship, working across agency boundaries, which I think Jeroen also touched on. I just want to be clear too, what do we mean by this term regulatory system? So designing and getting the legislation passed is one element of it, but we know that's not enough. That doesn't deliver a change in the world. So there's a whole lot of other things required. So those 8 functions, which I've already spoken about, but also the institutions and practices that are needed to make this thing like real, to actually happen in the world. So in my second slide here, I'm going to tell you how we talk about regulatory stewardship today in MB. So what we've done is we've taken that concept of regulatory stewardship and we've taken it down into 9 components or practices to make it tangible or real. So we've led to 6 practices in the blue and green boxes. So what we would say good regulatory stewardship practice is having the right governance structures in place, strong system leadership and a clear strategy. It is about having a culture that supports working together and achieving the objectives of the system. It's about resourcing to ensure effective functioning of the system. It's about having the insights to understand the system and to understand and mitigate the risks. It's about ensuring that your system is regularly reviewed, and when changes are made, it's informed by a variety of perspectives, such as the public. You might have international components there. And of course, here we also pay very careful attention to our Māori Crown partnership and what that means for the functioning of our regulatory systems. And finally, it obviously includes important delivery activities to support the good regulatory outcomes. So being risk-based, having a clear rationale for our activities, and continuous improvement. So from those 6 practices, you begin to be able to consider your system performance in terms of its effectiveness, efficiency, and durability. The diagram is really important because what it shows is this is not a hierarchy of practices. They are all really important. It may be that depending on the maturity of your regulatory system or your size or scale, certain aspects might take on more importance at certain times, but we would say that all are required. And probably the point I'll make today is that while I'm really proud of this work that we've actually done to describe the practices and what good looks like, at least so far as we know today, but what really matters is how we support and encourage the application of these practices. So I'm going to go back into the mists of time to 2014 and show you how we've taken the practices and put them into reality. Noting first, when I do go through that, there are challenges to doing this. Jeroen's already touched on a number of them. We know that the case for stewardship is not necessarily well made or incentivised. We know that the formal drivers to invest in stewardship can be quite weak. Generally, it's not part of your usual accountability mechanisms. We know that resourcing is really hard to do this in systems themselves. How do you get the time out of your day job to actually think of your whole system, of the future of that system and how the component parts are working? And I'd say too, we lack, even if you've got a whole ton of money to do this, there's not a big pool of people that have experience in this way of working. Definitely we can grow them, and that's part of our work here, but there is a limited pool at this stage. But despite all this, we have made progress. So here we are in 2014 when stewardship begins. And what I'm going to say here is that one of our real critical enablers has been chief executive and senior leadership engagement and endorsement. MB is a relatively new ministry, and our first ever chief executive, David Small, really understood regulatory stewardship, and he saw it as a unifying concept for this new agency. So he was responsible for our very first investment, which was literally a one-man band, but one person appointed to stimulate interest in this concept of regulatory stewardship. We're on to our second chief executive now, Carolyn Tremaine, and she also recognises and champions regulatory stewardship and has made a significant investment in it, which I will get to. And I think the key point is that with CE and senior leadership engagement, it's really important for that proposition that regulatory stewardship is an investment to be made, and you will find ways to make it. So back in 2014, one of the first interventions was to begin to talk about a regulatory system and it being made up of those 8 functions, which I described earlier. And this was an intervention intended to broaden awareness within MB that we actually work in these things called regulatory systems. You could locate yourself in a system and work out who else is working in it. And I will say that is an ongoing piece of work. Secondly, we began an experiment with a thing called charters. So a charter helps, it's a piece of work you do with others in your system to work out what is this system here to do, what's its purpose, what are its objectives, and to then bring clarity to who is responsible for what within the system and how you may handle gaps and overlaps. You can find 6 of those on our public website. I think one of the things we learned early on here is not to be too impatient about progress, especially when you have such a small resource. But what you'll do is quickly find a tribe of like-minded people who get this. And the other thing to mention in 2014 was that we had the release of our Productivity Commission's report into New Zealand's regulatory practices and institutions, which literally we call the Bible. We go back to all the time. So despite it being old in terms of 2014, it still actually is incredibly comprehensive and useful. So to my next slide, and in 2015, we start our next significant experiment, which have now become part of our core business. And these are regulatory system amendment bills. So what that enables you to do is to make small, uncontroversial amendments to your regulatory system on an ongoing basis. One of the findings from the Productivity Commission's report was that 2/3 of our chief executives were working with outdated legislation. I'll just talk to our second regulatory system amendment bill, which was the last one that we've had passed, and it made 150 amendments to 20 acts. And as an example, in the Housing Amendment Bill, which was part of the Regulatory System Amendment Bill, it increased the maximum fine for retirement village operators who provided misleading advertising. And so what that enabled us to do was to put in place greater protection for our ageing population at a vulnerable stage in their life. So we're in our current bill, we're up to 157 amendments across 37 acts. So these are really not small undertakings. And you can see we got an addition to our regulatory resource to support that type of work. And probably two lessons here we found is it's really easy to quickly lose the original rationale behind even a small uncontroversial change. So we've needed to step up our information management there. And it's actually really also vital to ensure that we protect the integrity of this bill process, which means that we will not accept controversial things into it because that will undercut its integrity, even if ministers ask us to do so. So to my next slide, moving on in time, and it's 2016 and we're getting a bit more momentum. And we published our first regulatory stewardship strategy. This was a requirement from our Treasury, but what it did was it actually, I think I wrote the words forced here, maybe encouraged people to get together to define their regulatory systems, and it actually included a fitness for purpose element, which we hadn't done before. So what the strategy implicitly did was set out our overall change approach. So first of all, bring visibility to the concept of stewardship and of regulatory systems, and bring some visibility to the performance of those regulatory systems. And secondly, by bringing people together to discuss these systems, the hypothesis was that good things would follow. In some respects that did. We've really seen some of our systems absolutely take this concept to heart, and our building regulatory system, for example, is a great example where now we've got really strong leadership of the system. They've really worked hard on their roles and responsibilities and are now pushing into domains such as measuring the impact of the system, understanding system risk. In 2016, down the bottom there, you'll see another important government investment in stewardship, which was the establishment of the Government Centre for Dispute Resolution, or GCDR. GCDR came out of a project in MB which looked at how to improve the efficiency and consistency of MB's dispute resolution services, which concluded that there was actually significant work to do both within MB and across government. So the GCDR was established as a permanent resource to do this, and the first step building up a picture of what best practice looked like. And the important lesson there was to know and articulate what good looks like, which goes for stewardship as well. And that to drive change, you really need to encourage and embed a culture of continuous improvement. So what GCDR did after defining what good looked like was to provide a way for schemes to self-assess how they matched up against that picture of good and a framework to support their continuous improvement. And we also wanted a way as stewards of the entire dispute resolution system to better understand the current state of the system and to be able to encourage and monitor progress over time. And so the Aotearoa best practice framework for dispute resolution was produced, and you can see the link to it there. It's really great work. And the lesson there being that whatever measures or tools you develop, it must be done like with people, not to them, and they must see value in using them. And that's the same for my sort of honeycomb picture as well. You have to have the buy-in to get the traction. So to my next slide, in 2017, we had what was called a performance improvement framework, where people come in and assess how an agency is performing. And our 2017 review said, hey, you're doing good stuff in this regulatory stewardship world, but you need to set a goal. And the lesson here was, I think, frankly, any goal would do, because what a goal can do is it can act as a focus and motivator to help orient people towards stewardship and get some traction. It probably would have also been helpful in hindsight to have had more of a front-end conversation about what we meant by regulatory stewardship and what we wanted to achieve with it. and instead that was left relatively silent, and a decentralised approach had been developed, which meant that there wasn't really the infrastructure to support people learning across different systems. But what we can see here is that we've grown to 5 now. I'll be one of those little faces. This is when I joined the team. And what we found there was establishing a goal actually was a tipping point for us to enable us to get more resource. So we set a goal of becoming a world-leading regulatory steward, and we set 6 stewardship objectives to be achieved by 2022. They were things like ensuring that we collect the right information to identify problems and vulnerabilities, and we needed to have the right role clarity of our systems. And our lesson here is that this is necessary but not sufficient. I think the lesson is that we set something from the top, you also must test it from bottom up, and that's again how we ended up with our current way of talking about regulatory stewardship, because that was the approach that we took. In 2019, my next slide, this is where we had a significant investment in regulatory stewardship. We've actually become a branch now, so 24 FTE in total. So formed with 3 teams, I lead the stewardship development team. We develop the tools and services needed to support confident regulatory stewards. GCDR joined us, whom I've already mentioned, and we've been joined by a regulatory system assurance team, so a new type of function, which has set up a 2-year program of reviews using a maturity assessment tool, which is based on those practices I outlined earlier. So building the branch helps with the challenge of investing in stewardship, but we'd also be clear we don't do stewardship for our systems. We're there to support them to do it. And finally, my last slide is where we are today. And the last thing I'll call out here is our work on regulatory system governance. And that's about explaining why it's important, what it is, and how to do it. And this is hard work, because this is where you cross boundaries. You may have Crown entities involved. You will have other government agencies. So it's quite different from your organisational or private sector governance, but it's a great learning space to be in. So that's the end of my slides, and in summary, I hope you can see how the way we talk about and practice regulatory stewardship has changed over time, and who knows what the future will hold for us. Lorraine had asked me to talk about what we'd do differently if we had to start again, which I found really hard to answer because we really have learnt by experimentation. But I think the perennials are 3 things. One is think and talk and act as a system. Without this, I don't think you can progress. Second, think early about your model for stewardship. Is it sort of a central resource? Is it something in the systems themselves? What is the goal? What are you oriented towards? And third, when you think and act as a system, you'll open up demand for other things, such as a system strategy or system risk. And that's the exciting work for me over the next few years. Kia ora, Lorraine, back to you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And now we will take some questions. And just a reminder that our guests have very generously agreed to answer some of these questions afterwards as well. So the most popular question we have today is, it's changed. It's looking at this, Rebecca, this one is for you. If and when regulatory disaster strikes, does anyone reference all the hard work on regulatory stewardship, or is it all regulatory failure?
Oh, wow. Well, that's not an easy one. Jeroen, feel free to chip in. Oh gosh, it's a really good question. So when I think of the reports that have been done on regulatory failure, and believe me, we consume them because there's so much to learn from them, I would say that it's because there hasn't been regulatory stewardship in those areas where there have been failure. And so in that respect, it's not referenced, but for us, that only strengthens our desire to ensure that that is not us, essentially. That is not what any one of our secretaries or chief executives want here in New Zealand, and I'm sure much broader as well. Jeroen, would you have anything to add to that?
Look, it's a fantastic question, and there is unfortunately no short and easy answer to it. What I would say is that if this idea of stewardship is embraced seriously, you would also think about how are we dealing as a whole of government system with situations of failure, and acknowledging that at some point there will be a regulatory failure somewhere in the regulatory system. But being a steward of that system, you would also embrace or accept the responsibility of helping, at the very least, your colleague regulators solving that regulatory failure. And I think that is something where the idea of regulatory stewardship might actually help us to maybe not better prevent regulatory failures, but at the least respond better to them.
Lorraine, can I just one more chip in there? Yeah, even if it's an inefficiency equation in a regulatory system, but what he's right, regulatory stewardship could help you identify those big ones earlier and stop it. So right, we're not having to do the billions of dollars of remediation later, and it should help you with your risk management when something occurs. One of the tools some people use are like pre-mortems of things, so what could go wrong, and play that out and work out how you'd respond to it. And I think what we have seen here in New Zealand as well is when there has been an agency that's had a failure, they often are able to access experts from other agencies who can support them to recover and to put themselves in a better position for the future.
Thank you. Jeroen, we'll start with you on this one. How do you measure success of regulatory stewardship?
Yes, that's again one of those fantastic questions. It's almost the same one as, can stewardship help prevent regulatory failure? Look, whatever philosophy, whatever guiding philosophy you will have for your regulatory systems, measuring success is going to be incredibly difficult. But what regulatory stewardship might help you, at least what this idea of regulatory stewardship as looking at your regulatory systems as a shared asset, what it might help you to do is, again, work with your colleagues, work across the regulatory system, and try to distill those success stories that you have in the system. So if we cannot give the very clear success answer that every dollar that we put in is going to prevent a dollar of failure, which could be one way of measuring success, the concept of regulatory stewardship might at the very least help you to say, look, for us, the government, or for us, the regulatory industry, a successful regulatory system is the following. Here is what we as regulators share with, here are the guiding principles that we as regulators share. This is how we are going to introduce it. And achieving equitable, accountable, transparent, and whatnot delivery of regulatory outcomes, that is what we consider to be success. And we work together to build those success stories. So I do understand that I've talked a little bit around the answer, what is success in regulatory stewardship? But I hope it will become clear that it might help you to, on time, think about how are we going to create those success stories, where are we going to find them, and how do we do this in collaboration across the different regulatory agencies. Rebecca, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'd say too, probably the take we've taken is not necessarily success, but maturity. Yeah. So what's your maturity in regulatory stewardship, which is just a bit more nuanced. And so then we would say the maturity rests around those 6 practices I talked about. What's your maturity in terms of your governance of your system, your leadership of your system, your culture, your delivery practices, etc. So that's the job of our regulatory systems assurance team, is to actually assess and review those practices so that we can get a picture of the maturity. And it's from there, I think, our role will be to also identify where we've got good practice that we can share across, and perhaps also lessons that we can learn from different systems as well.
Great stuff, thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here together, and Rebecca, I might start with you. So looking at deregulation and stewardship, Are these inherently contradictory ideas? And how has New Zealand avoided the pendulum swing in regulatory policy across different governments?
Have we avoided it? Well, these are great questions. I'm loving it. Maybe just to talk a little about the sort of ministerial involvement in regulatory stewardship is that there has been a minister, originally was a minister for deregulation, that was some years ago, then became the Minister for Regulatory Reform, and now I believe that the responsibilities are rolled into the Minister of Finance's portfolio. And I think what we've found from having that ministerial engagement there is that whilst there might be a focus on how do you reduce the regulatory burden, we're still able to provide advice around what that means from a stewardship perspective. And that's the job of public servants, right? Like, we're here to give the free and frank advice, and having a stewardship I guess mindset and set of practices enables us to do that. Jeroen, we had chatted about this another time. I remember I think you had a probably better answer about the pendulum swing. Do you want to chip in here?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Again, really good set of questions. When it comes to the pendulum swing, when it comes to regulatory ideals such as cutting red tape or indeed introducing deregulation, I personally think that the charm of the concept or the idea of regulatory stewardship is that it is inherently not tied to a specific political philosophy, whereas deregulation is tied to a specific political philosophy, and you could even say that the swinging of the pendulum is partly influenced by whatever political philosophy is in power at some point of the day. So what I hope to see and expect to see here in New Zealand is that by asking a political philosophy free question about what is a good regulatory system, what is good management of a regulatory system, what is good delivery through what is the good delivery of regulatory outcomes through that system, how are we dealing with the people in that system, how are we engaging people who we affect with that system. By asking all those questions and taking the political philosophy out, you might be able to get really good fundamental changes that then eventually would allow a more regulation-heavy political agenda as well as a more regulation-light political agenda. So I don't see that regulatory stewardship is inherently in conflict with the idea of deregulation or whatever way the pendulum swings. I actually see it as a much more practical way of asking, again, political philosophy-free questions about what is a good regulatory system. And that is what I really admire about how regulatory stewardship has been set up here in New Zealand, and indeed how MB is currently putting it into practice.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to get Rebecca to answer very briefly the following question, which is how are agencies incentivized to surface their vulnerabilities when these may be damaging, for example, reputation?
Oh, great question. That is probably one of the unsaid challenges that I've got here. So I would say that a learning culture is absolutely fundamental and vital to enable that to happen. And some of the feedback we've had when we're trying to establish regulatory system governance is that you actually have to be really vulnerable to have an open and honest conversation about your regulatory system. Because unless you do, it's a bit of window dressing. So I think there's something there about the orientation towards a learning culture that enables you to do that. What's your incentive? I think your incentive comes from the tone from the top. What does your chief executive want? I know that ours wants us to really shake our systems, and so that incentivizes us to be able to have these conversations.